guest who's popped into the studio this morning, Dr. Michael Frost. Good morning, Dr. Michael Frost.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us this morning. We're going to unpack a couple of things. First of all, who you are.
Yeah.
And then there's a program on TV at the moment called Testify, and we're going to unpack that just a little bit. So I gave you a brief introduction. Now, I don't think it was very fair because you're a little bit more than an Auckland-based theologian.
I'm a whole human being.
Yeah. You know? Well, there you go.
I am more than my titles.
And you do more than a podcast called In the Shift. So tell us who you are.
Yeah, so look, I am a theologian. You could say that. Get the letters in front of my name. So I do a bunch of theology. I host this podcast, and then I also work still within church spaces as well. So co-leading a church community in Auckland as well. So yeah, few and parenting, which is like a whole thing, isn't it?
Well, we just met your son
situation.
Rufus, who's in with producer Tabs at the moment on babysitting duties in there.
Yeah. School holidays, eh?
Yeah.
So why the shift?
Yeah.
To In the Shift podcast, what brought that about?
So I think I had been going through my own process. Like I grew up in the church and has certainly, I've been within kind of Christian spaces my whole life. But I went through a period of time of as I started to study, and also as I got older, I got into my sort of mid to late 20s and started to go, I need to think about what I believe and where it's come from and why I believe it. And as I did that, and as I engaged in some study and for myself, I guess my own faith went through a kind of evolution, and there's a certain level of discomfort that comes with that process, of am I the only one who's kind of thinking these thoughts or asking these questions or wondering about this, and everyone else seems to be like having a great time, and I'm sitting here going, I'm not sure, what I think about that. And so I went through my own process of that for a number of years. I guess, I think that's maybe the lifelong journey. And so I started a podcast a few years ago just to kind of open that experience up for others, and found that turns out there's a lot of people experiencing the same kind of thing. So but don't feel there's a lot of space to talk about it, or they maybe feel pretty lonely in it. So I wanted to create a bit of conversation, a bit of space, a bit of community for people to be able to go, oh, okay, how can I process those questions and reflections and sort of make some sense of where I go from here?
I've heard the term sort of deconstructing your faith over the last couple of years, and never really had heard that before. Do you find is that kind of what you're sort of talking about? Does that sort of describe what you were kind of going through? Because I know for other people that maybe have quite a similar story of growing up in a church or being surrounded by Christian culture, maybe, and then at some point, and often it is kind of somewhere in your 20s, early 30s, somewhere around there, it starts to, you're like, wait, why do I think this? And what really is this? Is this just because this is how I grew up? And what does this all really mean or look like in life? And is that kind of what you're tackling in the...
See, I think there's a couple of things. I think, one is that kind of natural part of growing up immersed within something that's very personal for you and very, very real, but then bumping into those big questions. And so deconstruction is a word that comes up a lot in those spaces. I'm not sure it's the perfect word, but it's a word that everyone's using. So it's kind of like, it was sort of, you run with the word that everyone's using.
It's a term.
I think in some sense, it's something that people of faith have always done, right? I mean, Jesus himself was like, you've heard it said, but I say to you. And, the Reformation was, if you like, if we were going to talk about that now, we'd probably talk about it as a kind of deconstruction.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a continual process of evaluation and reflection and asking questions, and it can lead in all sorts of different directions. But the hope is to provide some healthy spaces for that conversation rather than just kind of floundering around on our own,
That's awesome. We're going to segue nicely into talking about a program that's on TV where it opens up a lot of more questions. But you said, you're in a space where, okay, am I the only one thinking about this? One of the reasons why In the Shift podcast began. So when you got the affirmation that a whole lot of people were in that same space, was it like, oh man, dang, people are actually feeling the same way as I am? And is this a good thing for where the church is at? Where we at with that, with the thinking that when people jumped in and they're going, oh, wow, yeah, we actually are with you?
I think, I knew that there were people around having those conversations. Certainly, you hear a bunch of that stuff from overseas. I think what was missing maybe was New Zealand voices in that conversation. So there was maybe a surprise to the degree it resonated. I think what really hit me was, sadly, when we started talking about people experiencing harm within religious spaces.
Yeah.
That's when the floodgates opened in terms of audience, listenership, stories, and so my inbox got filled very quickly once we started talking about that with hundreds or probably thousands of stories from New Zealand people trying to process their experience of that. And so that's pretty devastating for the church, I would say, and something that we need to pay attention to.
But there's two sort of responses to that, right? And I've seen both from people of sort of really being like, wow, that's terrible, and we have to own that, you know, and look at it and learn from it and hear the stories and be willing to listen to the people that have been hurt and in all kinds of space. And then others that sort of push back against it, being like, this is almost an attack or something, or it's trying to take down the church, and why aren't we talking about the good things that the church has done? Because there are those too.
Yes.
But yeah, you sort of get two kind of responses. But I think, I'm much more in the camp of, well, if you want to improve things, you've definitely got to own them and be realistic about, damage church has done to people and stories of people that have slipped through and haven't had a good experience. Are you with your podcast? Just because I haven't tuned in, but what's kind of format?
Change your life. Obviously, it'll change your life.
I will be tuning in now. I quite like you, actually.
I like you too.
I think
Is it kind of interview based? Is it you just speaking? Do you talk to other people, or
it's a bit of a mixture.
Format?
So there's a bunch of stuff that's me talking, and then in particular in the last probably couple of years, there's been a lot of conversations with others as well. Yeah, and some of those are just people who have experiences, and some are kind of experts in field and stuff.
We'll get Michael to give you where you can find that podcast, but we're going to unpack what Michael is actually a program that's on TV, which actually looks at a local mega church. It's a drama series. It's going to be interesting to see. If you've watched it, be interesting to know what your thoughts are on about it as well. So stick around, Dr. Michael Frost. Very cool to have Dr. Michael Frost in studio with us, host of In the Shift podcast. We'll give you all the details of how you can get a hold of that. Good morning again, Michael.
Good morning.
Okay, now we're going to unpack this program that's on TV at the moment. It's called Testify.
Yeah.
It's a local mega church drama series. I caught it for the very first time last night. I'll be honest, I didn't watch the whole episode. But tell us what it's about.
Well, yeah, so I watched it, a couple of episodes over the weekend for the first time as well. It's a story that it's clearly drawing on some of the stories that have been in the news over the last few years around that kind of stuff in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And it's this intense kind of charismatic but flawed senior leader figure, patriarch, who's kind of running this mega church in Auckland called Avow. Yeah. Complete with spinning logo and flashing lights and
it's
dance.
a full drama series, right? There's no documentary.
No, it's not a doco. No.
Just
There is no.
clarify for anyone.
No, this is not a scathing takedown of our church. So yeah, this fictional story, and he kind of rules the church with an iron fist. And then his son is this charismatic youth pastor who spends his time with the down and outs, but he's much more empathetic and sort of coming alongside people and trying to journey with them. And so, at least, I mean, there's about 17 plots going on in the story at the same time, which I think is probably a bit much. But part of the story is this tension between these two different visions of like faith and church and community and what drives us. And one is kind of trying to control things and cover things up. And there's scandals and abuse stories and things that are, woven through it all. And then there's this kind of scandals getting exposed kind of storyline that runs through it as well. So
there are a lot of storylines, and I got mixed up when I caught it obviously late. There's obviously a few episodes that I haven't watched, but there is a lot happening. What's your take on it as far as representation is concerned?
I think it's always interesting. Like, I'm always fascinated when pop culture portrays the church back to us, because I think, I can have my sort of criticisms or critiques of what the show is doing, and it kind of takes every possible church scandal and lumps them all into the same kind of 7-day, period within one church. And so, there's critiques of that. But I'm always fascinated by these portrayals because I think they're, again, going back to your thing before the break about how do we respond to that? Do we see it as an attack or do we open ourselves up to the conversation? I think opening up to the conversation is really important. Like, instead of approaching it of like, that's not a fair representation of us, that the question might be, why? That seems to be the way people are seeing us, right? So what is that telling us about people's experiences with the church, with Christians? What is that telling us about the way in which the church may or may not be perceived, whether that's always fair or not? There was Wilberforce research done in New Zealand last year that was asking people in New Zealand about their views on this kind of stuff. And people generally have a very high view of, like, very kind things to say about Jesus. They describe Jesus in these really positive terms. And then when they describe the church.
They don't use the same
they're not
words.
the words are not the same. The
Yeah.
words are like judgmental, hypocritical,
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff. And so I think what a show like this is doing for us is holding up a mirror, maybe to our worst features, right? Which we can feel uncomfortable about, but that's a good thing to see if we want to live up to the aspiration of what church kind of
But cool.
talks, you know?
Yeah. It's funny that the show is out because a number of years ago, I sat down with a friend. He was flatting with us at the time. He works in film and media and stuff. And we had basically this idea for a TV show. We're like, we were thinking to be a comedy. We're like, wouldn't it be funny to do like a church comedy in New Zealand of like a small sort of church that's sort of burgeoning into maybe a small mega church and the teething issues of, because so many people in New Zealand have an experience with the church. It's quite a common thing. I know we're not an overly religious country, but I think a lot of people have had some experience with that. And
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of relatable content in there in terms of, anyway, we just had such a great time piloting an episode of what you could do and hopefully show some sort of genuineness of the hearts of people, although they're very flawed, which we all are in the church. I mean, this is a very different sort of take. It's a drama. But yeah, what you say about, when it shines a light back on us of how do people who are, because I don't know if this is made by Christians at all or anybody that's that associated with the church, but maybe it's best that it's not, because it's like, well, how do they see us?
Yeah.
Like, how are we known outside of the echo chamber of other Christians
Yeah.
and people in the church who are like, I think the church is doing really well. But what about the people that aren't in the church at all? What do they think about the church? How are we coming across? And why do people feel often quite negative about Christians?
Yeah, and if, there are reasons. If they do feel negative about it, they usually have reasons for it. And it's not just because they want to be bad and the church is making them, that's
Yeah.
not the only reason coming through, right? And it's a little bit like I get the feeling, like if someone started speaking really negatively about my family, right, I would feel defensive and want to protect.
Yeah.
And that can be a really healthy thing. But also we know even within families, right, sometimes that instinct to protect ends up covering up real harm, abuse and dysfunction because we're so concerned with kind of protecting our family. And I think the same kind of thing is true with the church when it's too concerned with kind of protecting itself and its reputation and its family, that it is unable to hear critique or is unable to hear a story from somebody who says, actually, I came through your church and I'm still dealing with the harm of that years later, after 5 years in therapy and a burnout and whatever. We have to be able to hear that, I think, rather than be like, oh, no, we do lots of good, as our first kind of response to that. So that's a challenge. That's a hard thing to do because it requires you to go, oh, that hurts, but we need to listen.
Okay, so we have listened because we've experienced this here in Aotearoa the last few years. So what would be our response to be able to get people who aren't familiar with church to meet us halfway?
I'm going to say that the first instinct is actually is to not worry about our reputation. So in terms of trying to come halfway, because I think what's done most damage to the church's reputation is the church trying to protect its reputation.
Yeah.
And this is not just a mega church situation, right? The Royal Commission inquiry, results of that are coming out this year, which are going to show all sorts of things within church institutions and religious institutions across the country. So rather than sort of thinking about it in those terms, I guess I want to approach it from the perspective of if we became communities, and many communities are like this, right? But if we were communities who spoke up for victims, who when people said this hurts and this is harmful, we gathered around them and cared for them and centered them in the story, I don't think we'd have to worry about trying to meet people halfway because I think the story about the church would change over time.
Sure.
And so I think like the responsibility, I think, for us is to go, how can we be more Christ-like in the church, in the way that we care for people and listen to people? I mean, Jesus himself was a victim of, religious power and control and all that kind of stuff. So that's at the center of our story. So if we can center that story again and center people who have suffered within those kinds of spaces, then maybe we'll find that story starts to turn around over time by itself rather than us sort of having to try to do that.
Actually, well said. You know, you're good. You should actually host a podcast.
I'll think about that. Thanks.
Yeah. What's your podcast called, and how can people get a hold of it?
It's called In the Shift, and you can listen to it everywhere you get your podcasts. I guess.
Yeah.
You know, all the
Google is
usual places: Apple, Spotify, all that kind of stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Michael Frost, for joining us this morning. It's been really, really insightful and been really cool to chat to you, Michael.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for popping in. This is Life FM on the Morning Wake Up.